We're on step 11 of how do I plot a novel, memoir, or screenplay. Today we're going to talk about turning points. Turning points in your story are critical because it is when the energy of the story that is moving forward all of a sudden shifts. And what's wonderful about that is that it takes audiences and readers a little off their guard, that they are, sort of getting lulled into complacency, thinking, oh, I can sort of understand this story, I know where we're going, what's happening, and then you do a turning point and the reader and the audience has to sit up a little straighter and concentrate again because they're not exactly where they thought they were going to be in the story right then. So you want to be able to use turning points throughout the entire piece, whenever you can, where it feels organic to the story and it feels right to the reader. It's just unexpected. But there are three major turning points in every story, and that's what we're going to talk about today. One of the major turning points is the climax, and that turns the entire piece to the end. It's the crowning glory of everything. And we covered the climax in steps 7 and 8. So if you'd like to go back and check those, it will talk more about the end and the climax. Today we're going to talk about the end of the beginning. And I know I haven't spent a lot of time on the beginning itself, which is the first quarter of the project. The reason for that is I don't want you to get too locked into the beginning. For most writers that I work with, in the plot consultations I do with writers all over the world, is writers really get stuck in the beginning, or the beginning and partway into the middle, but they can't quite force themselves out of that. They keep coming back to what's familiar, because the beginning is easier on a certain level, because it is introductory. You're not showing the depth of emotion, you're not showing the depth of the flaw, the depth of the character. You're just getting the piece set up in an inviting, exciting, tension-filled, action-packed sort of way, depending on what your genre is. But then the end of the beginning comes, and we spoke about it a little bit in step 7 when we were talking about the end of the beginning for you as the writer in the series, because we were launching from the introductory of what you need to plot to actually plotting the story. But now we're going to talk about the end of the beginning for your story itself. The end of the beginning symbolizes that the beginning is over. The introductory piece is over. We're no longer where it's on a more superficial level. Now we're going to go into the depth of the story itself, into the exotic world, and we're going to really explore what's happening with the action and the character. So what the end of the beginning really does is it launches the reader and the audience from the introductory world to the actual true story, the real story, which is a little odd because, you're writing a book or a screenplay and the whole thing is the story. But I hope that you see when I give you some examples that I've used earlier that you'll see how what I'm trying to say makes sense. So in step 1 we talked about goal setting, and we'll do a little bit more of that in the next session. But I'm taking 3 of the examples that I used in step 1 to use again, just to help make my point here. So the first one was where the wild things are, and we talked about the goal for Max, what he was doing and what was going on in the story for him, both in the movie and in the book, the picture book. So the end of the beginning for him comes right on the 1/4 mark of the book. If you add up all the pages and divide by 4, you'll see where the end of the beginning happens. That's when he is sent to his room, because he's been a wild thing, and he goes to his room without dinner. And what happens is his bedroom begins to transform and become a forest. Well, as soon as that happens, you feel the shift in the story. We're no longer meeting the mom and the dog and Max and, the havoc that he's creating in the family by being such a crazy guy. We're now really going into the real story world, which is the imaginary place that Max goes to. And it starts as soon as his room starts to transform. So there's that moment. It's a turning point. We're turning from the ordinary world to the exotic world. And it's done really well in the picture book because it's all through illustrations. It's really just the illustrations. It's not words. A second example is To Kill a Mockingbird, and we use that in step 1. And I'm using it here again because I want to show you how in the very beginning of that story we meet Scout and her brother and Dill and the father, and we sort of understand where they are historically and the location and all of that. But at the 1/4 mark in that book is when summer comes and the father is going to begin the trial. And at that moment, we realize that the introductory part of the story is over, and we're now launching into the real story itself, which is the exotic world for this young protagonist to be living with her family while her father is going to try a trial that is controversial and will shake up the whole town and her entire life. The end of the beginning scene in that book is brilliant. She wakes up, Scout wakes up in the middle of the night, and it's snowing in Macomb, which it has never snowed there before. And she's being woken up because her father says there's a fire next door, you got to get out of the house. And she and her brother run out. The father says, you got to stay on the sidewalk, don't move, because I don't want to worry about you while we're fighting the fire. So Scout and her brother Jem stand on the sidewalk. They're facing all of the excitement as the fire truck is trying to get there, and it breaks down and people are falling out of windows, and all of this happens. And then when the fire is over, Atticus comes to the kids, and then he sort of in a stern voice turns to Scout and says, I told you not to move. And she said, I didn't move. And Jem, says, no, she didn't. And he said, well, where did that blanket come from? And there's a blanket, gives me goosebumps, there's a blanket that's been wrapped around her shoulders. And the only person that could have probably done it is the person that lives right behind where they were standing, and that's Boo. When that happens, the whole story shifts. Boo is no longer this scary, varmint-eating, blood-dripping, hands and face guy. He's a benevolent figure who is caring for Scout. That turns her world upside down. And it's a perfect turning point. It's completely unexpected by both the protagonist, but especially the reader and the audiences for the movie. It's like, oh my gosh, everything shifts, and because of the shift, we now have left behind the ordinary world, and we're going with the protagonist into the exotic world. Okay, so the last example I'm going to use is Grapes of Wrath, which is Steinbeck. And when we meet the protagonist, who's Tom Joad, he's just coming home from prison, although we don't know that at first because he's so sort of mysterious. But we know that he wants to get home because he wants to just have a quiet life. He wants to live the life of his father and his grandfather before him, and be, have a farm and be a sharecropper and do all of that. Well, by the time he gets home, which is towards the end of the beginning, or towards the end of the first quarter point, he realizes that his whole family is packed up. They're all packed, the truck is packed, and they're leaving because their house has been knocked down by the corporate bankers and the corporate farmers who are trying to drive out all of the sharecroppers. So the moment that Tom Joad gets into the vehicle with his family, and they leave their home that has always been the home that he's grown up with, the home he came home to try to make for himself. They take off, they drive away, the red dust of Oklahoma is billowing behind them. They're undergoing the journey, and in that moment the story shifts. The end of the beginning has happened. We know who all the members of the family are. We know what their circumstances are. We know where they're going, what's happening. And at that moment when they all are in the truck and the truck moves forward, the end is over, and they now are entering the exotic world, which is the journey.